Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AE 911 Truth's webinar series. It's the month of October, and I know I said last time we did this, we had a Building 7 presentation, and I said we'd be doing the Twin Towers, but our Director of Strategy and Development, Ted Walter, has an excellent presentation tonight that he's going to be giving, and it surrounds Building 7, so we're breaking the mold a little bit here this evening. So let me go ahead and bring him in. Now, this is Ted Walter. He's Director of Strategy and Development here. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of California, Berkeley. He's the lead author of Beyond Misinformation, What Science Says About the Destruction of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7, as well as AE's World Trade Center Physics publication and the Request for Correction to NIST World Trade Center 7 report. And the name of his presentation tonight, you're going to see it appear on the screen. It's called Unscientific Method, How NIST Sidestepped the Evidence of Building 7's Demolition. So before he gets started, let me just say that we're going to be taking your questions. Best way to submit them is to write them in the YouTube chat box. It helps if you write question before it. I'll also be looking at the Facebook broadcast of this as well for questions. Now, I've been noticing that there's sometimes the questions are not getting through, and I'm not exactly sure why. If that happens to you tonight, if you type something and it disappears for whatever reason, we're not doing it, write to us at AE911 Truth and let us know. We're going to start monitoring this stuff. And also for engineers out there, you can get credit for watching this presentation. All you got to do is write to us at CPD at ae911truth.org. You got to tell us your name, verify that you are an engineer, and also tell us what your biggest technical takeaway from this presentation was. So you send that in to us and you will get your credit. So that's the end of my bit. I'm going to hand it over to Ted. Ted, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, or thank you for watching this webinar if you're watching it afterwards. The title of this presentation, as you can see, is Unscientific Method, How NIST Sidestepped the Evidence of Building 7's Demolition. So this presentation is a little different from some of the other presentations that we give under the Project Due Diligence program. Those presentations focus primarily on NIST's probable collapse sequence and the engineering analysis and the modeling techniques that NIST did. And those presentations show really that NIST's probable collapse sequence is physically impossible. It just couldn't have happened. And so you can find those on our webinars page. This presentation is going to go into the direct evidence of controlled demolition that NIST in one way or another sidestepped. And we touch on those briefly in the other presentations that I mentioned. But this presentation is going to go more in depth with that evidence and how NIST handled it. So when I talk about those other areas of evidence, what I'm talking about is really three basic things. The structural behavior of the building, so how the building, the motion of the building as it came down, the evidence of explosions that we have, and evidence of incendiaries. So this presentation is primarily going to draw from obviously the NIST report, which was published in 2008. It's also going to draw from a series of other documents that were produced over the last couple of years. Andy mentioned it in his intro of me. It's a request for correction to NIST's final report on Building 7, which AE911 Truth and several other requesters, who I'll name shortly, submitted in the spring of 2020. This is a process that essentially, and I will touch on it a little later, but allows you to seek correction to information that is published by federal agencies under the Data Quality Act. So there was a back and forth between AE911 Truth and NIST over the course of about a year. And this is where we get to see both the criticisms that we put forward of the NIST report, where we discuss the evidence, and then NIST's responses to our criticisms, and ultimately their refusal to correct their report. And so a lot of this stuff is sort of brand new information or brand new positions that NIST has taken just within the last year regarding its report and regarding the cause of the collapse of Building 7. So for those who don't know, Building 7 was a 47-story steel-framed high-rise located on the north side of the World Trade Center complex. And on the left-hand side, you see circled in red, Building 7. Just south of that, you see World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2. Those are the Twin Towers. And then other surrounding buildings in the World Trade Center complex. On the right-hand side, this is a photo that was taken during the destruction of the North Tower. And Building 7, you see on the bottom right of that photo. 47-story building, still very tall, taller than almost all the buildings in the immediate vicinity, with the exception of the towers. Okay, so before I get into the request for correction and the evidence and how NIST handled it, I want to do a brief look at the circumstances surrounding the collapse, and then sort of a really quick run through of the official investigations and non-official investigations, private investigations that have taken place. And so this is going to be about 5 or 10 minutes of really just background. But it's really important to know that, the context surrounding this building's collapse. And we're not just talking about something that happened in a vacuum. So the collapse of this building was anticipated for about 6 hours by officials who were at the scene. And I'm just going to read this and try not to rush through it, which I have a tendency to do when I read quotes. A police officer came to me, and this is a FDNY lieutenant, William Melarango, in his FDNY oral history. A police officer came up to me and told me that the facade in front of 7 World Trade Center was gone, and they thought there was an imminent collapse of 7 World Trade Center. I felt the location we were at was too close to 7 World Trade Center, so we advised citywide we were moving the staging area to North End and Greenwich Street. Probably around 11:30, we reestablished at North End and Greenwich Street. So this is one of the earliest, or the earliest account that I'm aware of where we have clear indication of when officials at the scene began predicting the collapse of this building. Next is a video. This is from the BBC, an interview that they did with FDNY Deputy Chief Peter Hayden.
The Deputy Chief of the New York Fire Department that day remembers the scene.
Well, we had our special operations people set up surveying instruments to monitor and see if there was any movement of the building. We're concerned of the possibility of collapse of the building. And we had a discussion with one particular engineer there, and we asked him if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and if so, how soon? And it turned out that he was pretty much right on the money, that he said in his current state you have about 5 hours.
Okay, so it is, as many people know, I haven't stated explicitly, no building prior to 9/11 had ever collapsed. No steel frame building had ever collapsed or completely collapsed due to fire. So although the Twin Towers had just come down, it's extremely unusual and suspect that any engineer would look at Building 7 and look at the damage to one face, or be aware that there's fires in the building, and say, you have this amount of time before this building is going to come down. It's totally illogical. I'm not going to put too much, faith in that story. Who knows? Like if that was literally the conversation that took place. But what's important here is that the foreknowledge surrounding the collapse of this building was certain, and it also turned out to be very accurate. So let's move forward here.
The Deputy Chief of the New...
Okay. One question we want to ask is, was this observation-based judgment, or was this information from others? People that stated that the building was going to come down, did they make that judgment for themselves based on the damage or the fires that they saw, or were they told by others? Dr. Graham McQueen, a prominent scholar in the 9/11 research community, looked closely at all the FDNY oral histories, and these were his conclusions. In the FDNY oral histories, there are about 60 FDNY members who report hearing warnings of 7's collapse. 7 FDNY members personally ascertained or affirmed the possible or definite collapse, while in 50 cases, this judgment was made by others, typically official superiors. So the anticipation of this collapse was really being circulated by, let's say, a handful of people who either judged or they themselves were told this building is going to come down. Now, this information, this foreknowledge of the collapse or warnings of the collapse circulated to the news media. And so I'm going to play a couple of those clips. This is actually a clip recorded by a CNN cameraman, Joe Cantali, and he's actually the one that says some of these statements that you're going to hear in this video. Don't know exactly what time this took place. I've heard it said that it was earlier in the day, but to me it feels like later. But that's not so critical so much as what the content of what he said.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Closer to the building, it was almost like nighttime. What was left of the building was a fiery hulk. The firefighters thought it might collapse. Pieces of the building kept falling. Rescue workers pushed people away from the scene.
We are walking back. It's a building about to blow up. Flame, debris coming down.
All right, let's move on here. Okay, and many people are going to be familiar with the BBC reporting the collapse 23 minutes before it occurred. This is the first report that BBC made at about 4:57 p.m. that day.
Some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed.
All right, and let's move on to this clip here. They actually report the collapse as possibly having happened 30 seconds before it does, and then you actually watch it happen live. So for those of you who are seeing the collapse of this building for the first time, keep an eye out. It's going to happen in the course of this video.
And this just into 7 World Trade Center, which is the building that is there burning now. We are getting reports that it might have collapsed. It is the building that has been on fire all day long, and we are getting reports that it might have collapsed. Joining us on the phone now is Scott Mezzo. Scott was actually on the 81st floor at the World Trade Center when this tragedy happened this morning. Scott, are you with us?
I am.
Scott, tell us where you were and what you saw.
I was in One World Trade Center. I was on the 81st floor, the south side of the building. A little before 9, we heard an explosion.
Scott, let me interrupt. You are watching Building 7 at the World Trade Center collapse. That is the collapse of Building 7 at the World Trade Center.
Okay. So the woman that was reporting beforehand to sort of report the collapse 30 seconds before it happens is quite extraordinary, I think. And then you can tell in the manner in which the Mail reporter reports it is something that they were anticipating. He was ready to report it because he had been told by all sorts of reports that were circulating that the building was going to come down for sure.
And this.
Okay. Now this clip occurs probably within a minute after the building went down. And I will just go ahead and play it. It's Brian Williams speaking with FDNY Lieutenant David Restuccio.
We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day.
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
Okay, so there we have 2 hypotheses basically for how this building came down. Either it came down on its own or it was taken down. And this FDNY lieutenant heard a report that it might be taken down. So right there, that is an explanation that I think we have to take seriously. Okay, so now we've moved to after the collapse. What I want to point out is what I will just call the absurdity, or let's call it the absurdity that officials beforehand were able to predict the collapse with certainty and precision and accuracy. And yet the engineers who went to study the collapse afterward were baffled. So this is a quote from the New York Times, November 2001. Engineers and other experts were for weeks still stunned by what happened to 7 World Trade Center. Experts said no building like it, a modern steel reinforced high-rise, had ever collapsed because of an uncontrolled fire, and engineers have been trying to figure out exactly what happened. So how does an event go from being completely predictable to being impossible to explain by the experts who are supposed to be able to explain it? Here's another example. In May of 2002, FEMA published a sort of preliminary report on the collapse. It's called World Trade Center Building Performance Study, Data Collection, Preliminary Observations, and Recommendations. And in the concluding section of the chapter on Building 7, they said this: the specifics of the fires in WTC 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Although the total diesel fuel on the premises contained massive potential energy, the best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. So again, how were officials able to predict something that had such a low probability of occurrence? Something that could not be explained 9 months later after the event. Let's continue. Now we are 5 years after the event. And this is the lead investigator for NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, being interviewed for an article in New York Magazine, again, March of 2006. At that time, NIST had been studying the collapse for, again, around 3.5 years, because they started their investigation in August of 2002. And at this point, he said, NIST did have some preliminary hypotheses on 7 World Trade Center, but then Sunder paused. But truthfully, I don't really know. We've had trouble getting a handle on building number 7. Okay, fast forward to 2008, and the mystery has now been solved. First, I'm going to play a clip where Dr. Sunder announces their conclusions. Oopsies.
Our take-home message today is that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery. World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires. It collapsed because fires, similar to those experienced in other tall buildings, burned in the absence of water supply to operate the sprinklers, and burned beyond the ability of firefighters to control it. It fell because thermal expansion, a phenomenon not considered in current building design practice, caused a fire-induced progressive collapse.
Okay, and in the next clip I'm going to play for you, Dr. Sunder basically describes the timeline of their investigation and discloses that it wasn't until the spring of 2007 that they came up with their theory of how the building collapsed.
And of course, as you have heard, there was obviously no plane that hit this building. There was some structural damage, but there was no thousands of gallons of jet fuel spread to simultaneously ignite multiple floors in this building. So it was a question was, why really did this building come down? And as we dug into it more carefully, we first looked at whether the columns may have had fuel because of the lot of diesel fuel that was stored in the building. And we quickly, based on some calculations, figured out the fires would have had to have been there for a very long time from the diesel fuel to actually bring this building down. And therefore, we then had to look further. And as we dug into it, we figured out that there was a phenomenon that we had not previously recognized in current practice, the issue of thermal expansion, which actually could cause this particular problem to happen. But that insight, we didn't have that insight till early last year, early part of 2007. And after that, it was so-called smooth sailing. But we had these horrendous computer programs, which took us, 6 to 8 months to complete a single run.
Okay, so suddenly they had an epiphany in early 2007 that, oh wow, it could have been thermal expansion. What that means is typically if a building is if there's going to be, let's say, a partial collapse because of fire damage, it's going to be because the steel, the members supporting the structure weaken due to the fire. They lose their strength. When we talk about thermal expansion, we're talking about beams or girders heating up and literally expanding because they're heated. This is how steel behaves when it gets heated up. So the idea is that the expansion of certain steel members could cause, failures to occur on certain floors by certain beams expanding and pushing other beams or girders, and then suddenly you get some kind of local failure, and that leads to then a larger progressive collapse. So this idea is quite novel, that you could have any sort of a serious structural failure, let alone a global collapse of a building because of thermal expansion.
And of course,
Okay. The mystery was then solved 3 more times by other groups that were studying the collapse. I'm not going to run through it in a lot of detail, but they were either working directly for or tied to 2 opposing sides in a lawsuit. Con Edison, the energy supplier in New York City, suing real estate developer Larry Silverstein, who owned Building 7, for the damage caused to the power station that was underneath Building 7. And so these 2 firms, Arup and Guy Nordetson, conducted one study. Weidlinger and Hughes Associates, other firms, conducted the study for Silverstein. There was also a professor named Jose Terrero involved with the BRE Center for Fire Safety Engineering, who was also an expert witness for Con Edison in that lawsuit, all coming out with different theories about how the collapse of the building at least initiated, and theories that contradict NIST theory. Girder A 2001, which is the key girder that we're not going to get into a lot of detail on, but is the key girder that NIST alleges triggered the collapse. Arup says that instead of it being pushed off of its seat, it was pulled off of its seat. Weidlinger, they don't talk about thermal expansion. They're talking about extreme heat, extreme weakening, and floors just collapsing because there's so much heat. And then the BRE Center for Fire Safety Engineering has a totally different theory about fire on the mechanical room, I believe, on the 3rd floor. So how do we have all these different theories of fire causing the collapse? Isn't there just one theory that we have all of this evidence for? And this is from a paper by Jose Terrero I just mentioned. He and his co-authors wrote, after years of investigation by some of the world's leading experts in both fire and structural engineering, there remains multiple possible hypotheses without any consensus on how the building behaved and failed because of the fire. And they continue, the collapse of WTC-7 remains to this day a unique event in the history of structural fire engineering. Despite occurring nearly 20 years ago, there's no real way to know exactly what caused its failure. So basically, he's saying that the mystery actually can't be solved. This mystery will go on forever. So what does all of this mean? Well, one thing that it means, at least, is that there is no conclusive evidence supporting any of these hypotheses. If there was conclusive evidence, there would presumably be consensus around it. And I think that we should view skeptically all of these fire-based theories, because if there was conclusive evidence, I think that a consensus would have developed around one of these. And it wouldn't have taken all of these engineers so long to come up with these theories. So we're going to focus on the NIST investigation because that is the investigation conducted by the U.S. government. NIST was statutorily mandated by Congress to establish the likely technical cause or causes of the building failure. It is thus the only investigation that is responsible to the public and guided solely by an interest in discovering the truth, or should have been, whereas the other investigations were private investigations that were part of a lawsuit. NIST had a $16 million budget and access to a wealth of data. And the NIST report is assumed by the media, by the public, to be the definitive account of the collapse. So we are going to focus on that. As I mentioned before, we, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, along with other requesters, submitted a request for correction to NIST in the spring of 2020 under the Data Quality Act. The Data Quality Act was passed around the year 2000 or 2001. Its goal was to ensure and maximize the quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of information disseminated by federal agencies. And part of the act required agencies to establish administrative mechanisms allowing affected persons to seek and obtain correction of information. And so that is the process that we use to try to get NIST to correct its report on Building 7. The requesters included 3 different groups of people. One of them was 9/11 family members. So on the left, we have the 10 9/11 family members who joined this request for correction. On the right, you see the faces of their loved ones who died on 9/11. Jeff Campbell, Gene DePalma, William Krukowski, Thomas Hetzel, Bobby McIlvaine, and Edward Papa. We were also joined by 88 individual architects and engineers, structural engineers, joined this. So there was a large number of people involved. You can see all of their names there. The goal of the request was for NIST to develop a new probable collapse sequence that is both physically possible and consistent with the data presented herein. So when we say physically possible, we're talking about the collapse scenario in the analysis that we do in our other presentations, showing that NIST collapse scenario actually just couldn't happen. It's physically impossible based on the structural features of the building, based on what we know about the fires. It's internally impossible. The other part of this is, does your scenario actually fit the evidence? Is it not only possible, but is it probable? Does it actually explain the evidence? And so you'll see that the request for correction was really divided into 2 sections that looked at those things. Part 1 of the request for correction looked at NIST computer simulations. Part 2 was called NIST's omission and distortion of evidence of explosions and incendiaries. Now, Section E is a little bit of it in its own territory because it had to do with NIST computer simulations, but it also looks at NIST's attempt through its computer simulations to explain the structural behavior of the building. And so Section E, along with sections F, G, and H, are what we're going to focus on for the rest of this presentation. Again, just reminding you what the 3 areas of evidence are: the building structural behavior, the evidence of explosions, and the evidence of incendiaries. And these are the different sections of the request for correction that correlate to each of those areas of evidence. So Section E, NIST global collapse analyses, looking at the structural behavior of the building, is where we're going to start. Okay, so this is a key claim that was made in the NIST report. Given the complexity of the modeled behavior, the global collapse analyses match the observed behavior reasonably well. The global collapse analysis confirmed the leading collapse hypothesis. So because there was no physical evidence, it was all destroyed in the weeks and months after 9/11, NIST's investigation basically conducted of coming up with a scenario that it could run in its model, and then it could say, our model matches the observed behavior in the videos. And so this is kind of a key claim here, is how well does our model match the observed behavior? If it matches it, then perhaps our hypothesis is correct. If it doesn't match it, then your model is actually disproving your hypothesis. And this is what we argue. The latter is what we argued in the request for correction. This was the claim that we made in the request for correction. Contrary to NIST's assertion, NIST global collapse analyses do not match the observed behavior reasonably well and do not confirm NIST's leading collapse hypothesis. So extending that forward, the claim that we made in the request was that NIST global collapse analysis predicts fundamentally different structural behavior from what was observed. So what was observed, and what I'm going to show you next, is 3 main things: lack of deformation, symmetry, and sudden freefall. So let's take a look at the video and let's take a look at NIST model. All right, first I'm going to play the same video we saw before during the news clip, but now there's none of the news graphics around it. Okay, and I should have pointed this out as it was playing, but first I'll play it once more, at least the first half of it. You want to look at the east penthouse that comes down first, because that's an important piece of this puzzle. So you'll see that right here on the left-hand side, right there. Okay, and on the right here, we have the animation of NIST's global collapse analysis. Okay, so a lot of people will look at that animation and say, well, that doesn't really look like the real thing. And those people, I think, are right. In the request for correction, we went a lot deeper and sort of methodically showed the ways in which this animation of the global collapse analysis did not match the observed behavior. Oopsies. Okay, so the lack of deformation. NIST does do us some favors. By us, I mean people interested in understanding what really happened. They do us some favors throughout their report here and there. One of them is in this figure, figure 5-201, where they overlay two separate shots of the building 2.5 seconds apart. One is 5 seconds after the initiation of the east penthouse collapse. The second one is 7.5 seconds after. So that's 2.5 seconds apart. And what you see as that white sliver is the amount of movement, the amount of motion that occurred from 5 seconds to 7.5 seconds. Now, the funny thing is that NIST says that the global collapse initiated 6.9 seconds after the east penthouse collapse initiated. So this is 0.6 seconds into the actual collapse. And what NIST actually points out themselves, and it's the quote at the bottom, is, interestingly, little movement of the northeast and northwest corners of the building is indicated. So NIST was sort of surprised because in their mind, the collapse initiated at 6.9 seconds, and this is at 7.5 seconds, 0.6 seconds later. And most of the building hasn't actually moved. We're going to get into that issue a little bit later, but the main thing to observe here is that there was no deformation. Whenever this collapse really started, there was no deformation, or very little. So just juxtaposing a few shots here, this is again at 5 seconds after the east penthouse collapse initiation. We see no deformation on the left, and on the right in the animation, we see a lot of deformation. It may not look, and it might not be totally evident, but actually, if that were happening in real life, you would see a lot, the walls just kind of caving in there on the eastern side of the building. This is at 7.5 seconds. So still on the left-hand side, as NIST showed us, the corners of the building haven't moved or deformed at all. On the right-hand side, the building has deformed significantly. And then this is at 8.1 seconds after the east penthouse collapse initiation. That's our anchor point. We're going to keep using that. So 8.1 seconds after. This is actually when the NIST model terminates. So that's why we have this frame here. This is as far as NIST goes. And obviously we see a significant amount of deformation, and we see virtually none on the left. Okay, and this is a figure from the NIST report just showing you that deformation from the west and from the south, just to make it very clear that we're talking about an entire side of the building basically caving in here in their model. So that's what, and then on the right, we've actually overlaid the, at a certain point, I believe that's at 7.5 seconds after the collapse initiation, we show how much deformation there is by overlaying what the building looked like before the collapse initiated. Now, NIST realizes that this is a problem, and so they try to downplay the extent of deformation that was predicted in their model, and they try to say only later in the model, after the initiation of global collapse, do the upper exterior wall deformations from the NIST analysis differ from the video images, trying to paint this picture that once the thing started to go down, there was a lot more movement, much harder for the model to predict the behavior, and you were going to start to see some deformation. Well, actually, when you look methodically at their animation, we see, and what I've done here is overlaid the animation right at the point that NIST says the collapse initiated. So in real life, the collapse, according to them, initiated 6.9 seconds after the East Penthouse collapse initiation. They say that in their model, they got the collapse to initiate at 6.4 seconds after, which they're happy with. So it's a half second earlier, but this is what they say is the start of collapse initiation, of global collapse initiation. And actually, the building has already deformed on the eastern side, has already deformed significantly. And yet they say in their FAQs that there was not any deformation until after the initiation of global collapse. This analysis shows that claim to be objectively false. So just to sum it up, NIST model proves that there would be lots of deformation if there were column failures occurring in the interior of the building. That is shown on the left. At initiation, significant amount of deformation already. On the right, 0.6 seconds into collapse, or what NIST says is the beginning of the collapse, there's no deformation whatsoever. So what does this mean? NIST global collapse analysis disproves NIST's hypothesis. If a sequence of core column failures were taking place, it would cause significant deformation to the exterior, deformation not observed in the videos. Okay, let's look now at symmetry. This section is a little bit shorter. There's not as much to show, but again, NIST does us a favor of describing what actually happened accurately. They write, both the northeast and northwest edges began to tilt toward the north shortly after the building began to move downward. The northwest edge initially tilted in a similar manner, but then settled back to its original line and fell nearly vertically, or directly toward or away from the camera. So if you look at the very bottom here, this bottom shot, you can see that a full 4 seconds into the collapse, the building is still falling symmetrically in a vertical line. That's quite remarkable. So this is, let us ask the question, does NIST's model fall vertically, or by any chance does it tilt north first, since that's what they say happened first to part of the building? No, actually the building tips to the south. On the left here, you see a figure of their model from the west, and you see the building is starting to tip south. If we take, again, the final shot, the final frame of NIST's animation, and compare it to when the building was standing upright, we see again that the building is tipping backwards or to the south, tipping away from the view of the camera or of the animation. And I want to emphasize that this is very early in the collapse. This is, again, 8.1 seconds after the penthouse collapse initiation. So over on the right here, we see this shot is 8.3 seconds. So this is very close to each other. Within 0.2 of a second, we get a lot of tipping of the building southwards. We got almost no movement here in the real thing. And yet, even 3 seconds later, in the real thing, the building is still traveling downwards almost perfectly vertically. I wonder where this building would be 3 seconds later if NIST allowed the animation to keep running. Chances are it would be far more tipped to the south and maybe halfway down, halfway all the way over. Maybe that's why they terminated it. What does this mean? Again, NIST global collapse analysis disproves NIST's hypothesis rather than proving it. NIST global collapse analysis cannot replicate the symmetrical vertical descent of the building. A natural progression of column failures cannot produce a symmetrical vertical descent, or that should be the takeaway. Okay, the third aspect of the building's behavior was its sudden free fall. And I add the word sudden there because we have now established conclusively that the transition to free fall was instantaneous, and instantaneous across the entire width of the building, not just at one point. So first of all, what I want to say is part of NIST being able to claim that their model matched the observed behavior reasonably well also involved mischaracterizing, at least in this case, mischaracterizing the observed behavior. So what we wrote here, to help its claim that the global collapse analyses match the observed behavior reasonably well, NIST mischaracterizes the observed behavior. So how did they do that? They came up with 3 stages of descent. Stage 2 is a stage that is generally agreed upon, that the building came down in free fall for at least 2.25 to 2.5 seconds. At first, NIST actually tried to deny that the building came down in free fall when they issued their draft report in August of 2008. Thanks to a public comment by physicist David Chandler challenging NIST's claim and showing that the building actually came down in free fall, NIST eventually reversed themselves and acknowledged in their final report that it came down in free fall. But to sort of stick with their original, make it somewhat consistent with their original claim, they sort of invented this stage 1. And that's where the mischaracterization lies. So NIST writes, in stage 1, the descent was slow and the acceleration was less than that of gravity. By 1.75 seconds, the north face had descended approximately 2.2 meters. So that stage 1 lasted about 1.75 seconds, and there was a small fall. The problem is, and what we really discovered as we worked on this request for correction, is that NIST based this claim. We didn't discover it, but it became, I would say, solidified through further research. NIST measured the downward motion by tracking the vertical position of a point near the center of the roof line. Okay, so maybe many people have probably seen this graph before. It is in the NIST report. It shows that period of free fall. But again, we're looking at that stage 1. What about this stage 1 here? The NIST came up with stage 1 based on this measuring the movement of a single point near the center of the roof line. What we find, and this is the key video that was used for this measurement by David Chandler, which he did in the spring of 2020, as we put the request for correction together. He used this video because you have a much better view than the video that NIST used for their measurement, which is that one that you've already seen from the northwest, looking up at it. This one, you have a straight-on view of the roof line, so you can measure more accurately, although I don't think that was the only reason that NIST got it wrong. But I'm just going to play this video once. Okay. And so what David Chandler did was he measured the motion of the building at 3 different points across the entire roof line of the building, the northwest corner, the center, and the northeast corner. And he had been, prior to that, basing his measurements mostly on the northwest corner of the building. And he realized that it would make sense and that it was possible to actually measure it at 3 different points. And when you measure at these 3 different points, first of all, it provides a little justification for NIST's claim regarding this stage 1, but really not. But you see what NIST's pathway was to making that claim. Basically, the center of the building, there was a little bit of movement. It dropped something like 0.5 meter and then stopped and then dropped another meter in the space of about 1.3 seconds. And then all 3 points across the roof line went into free fall almost simultaneously within 1/10 of a second of each other. And so that's what you see in these three sets of graphs. The top being the displacement, the motion and the bottom being the rate of the velocity, and which shows the acceleration. In all three cases, the acceleration was that of free fall for about 2.5 seconds, and they all went into free fall instantaneously and almost simultaneously. So we're talking about a building that is basically standing still, a little bit of movement in the middle, and then the whole thing goes into free fall. So this is, as I referred to earlier, this is corroborated by NIST in that first favor that they did for us. No movement of the corners 7.5 seconds after the east penthouse collapse initiation. So that's 0.6 seconds. That 6.9 second mark, we would say, is artificially early. And it's proven to be early because 0.6 seconds later, most of the building, the northeast and northwest corners, haven't moved at all. And so Chandler's analysis is actually consistent with what NIST showed us in its report. Okay, so from that, we derive three problems with NIST's stage one. The first one, which is the least significant, is that the initial movement at the middle of the roof line lasted 1.3 seconds, not 1.75. That's according to Chandler's analysis. More importantly, NIST wrongly portrays movement at the middle as a smooth transition to free fall, when in fact it dropped 0.5 meter, stopped, dropped another meter, and then entered free fall. All right, so it wasn't like a little buildup. It was actually like more of a jerky motion, and then the whole building went down together. Most importantly, the problem is that NIST generalizes the motion of the middle of the roof line to represent the motion of the entire roof line. So they say by 1.75 seconds, the north face, they don't say the middle of the north face, they just say the north face has descended approximately 2.2 meters. So in addition to making, which we're going to show here, making it easier for them to claim that their model matched the observed behavior, maybe what this is really about even more so is just painting the picture of a gradual buildup to free fall, because it's impossible. And NIST, the lead investigator, Dr. Shyam Sunder, said this in his 2008 technical briefing, that free fall would be impossible because that would mean an object that has no structural components below it. And so creating the stage one was about trying to paint some sort of a mental picture of how this building could actually experience free fall. Well, maybe if there was sort of a buildup to it and there was a sequence of structural failures, then we can get it. But really what we see is there's not a buildup. There's a little bit of movement in the middle, and then the entire building goes down as one. Okay, so when we look at their model, do we see a sudden transition to 2.5 seconds, roughly 2.5 seconds of free fall? This model on the left is very short because it's from the moment of global collapse initiation to the end of the model, which is about 1.5 seconds or less. Oh yeah, 1.8 seconds. I'll play it for you once more. Okay, and again. Okay, when we actually measured that amount of the distance that it traveled in that 1.8 seconds, we see a 1.5 story descent. So that's what we're pointing out here on the right. If you're able to look closely at it, you can see that it's descended about 1.5 stories, which is approximately 6 meters over that 1.8 seconds. And then it terminates right when free fall would be expected to begin. If we take NIST's 1.75 second stage one to be true, that would mean that around 1.75 or 1.8 seconds, we would then see free fall. And that's right when the model terminates. So the observation here, I just spell it out, what I was kind of just getting at. A 1.5 story, 6 meter descent followed by premature termination does not match the observed behavior that we know to be true, or even NIST 3 stages, because NIST stage 1 had a 2.5 meter drop. Yet NIST claims in its report the 3 stages of collapse progression are consistent with the results of the global collapse analysis. Well, that's just objectively false, because there's no way, there's no respect when you look at their animation of their model that it is consistent with either the 3 stages of collapse, or even at least the two, stage 2 and stage 3. But not even NIST's made up stage 1. So what does this mean? Just as before, NIST global collapse analysis disproves its hypothesis. NIST global collapse analysis cannot replicate the sudden transition to approximately 2.5 seconds of free fall. The reason I say cannot and does not is because I suspect, based on what we know from our other analysis or other criticism of NIST's modeling and its probable collapse sequence, is that NIST did everything it could to get its model to behave the same as the building actually behaved. And so this is the closest that it could possibly get. And that's why we say cannot. A natural progression of column failures cannot produce, the takeaway here is that a natural progression of column failures cannot produce a sudden transition to sustained freefall. Okay, so the question then is, how does NIST even come close to claiming that their model match the observed behavior? They have all of these observables that they say that their model either predicted or that are at least consistent with their things that observables that happen in real life that are temporally consistent with their model or with their collapse scenario. So there was an east-west vibration of the building of 2 inches that occurred 6 seconds before the east penthouse collapse initiation. There's a seismic signal, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that occurred approximately 10 seconds prior to the initiation of global collapse. Again, they're basically saying these events that we say happened, the failure of column 13 low in the building, which I haven't gotten into a lot of detail about their collapse scenario. I'm just showing how it doesn't explain the direct evidence of demolition. But they claim, as we're going to see in a little bit, that the failure of that column and the cascade of floor failures could explain this seismic signal that occurred 10 seconds before the global collapse of the building. You can see the rest of them there. A kink in the roof line, that was actually predicted in their model. Window breakage, that's not in their model. It's just a temporal correlation. The collapse of the east penthouse, and then the initiation of global collapse. So they're very pleased that they managed to get their model to predict the collapse of the east penthouse and the initiation of global collapse. But the problem is all of these observables are also consistent with the hypothesis of controlled demolition, if not more consistent or better explained by the hypothesis of controlled demolition. So aside from achieving the collapse of the east penthouse and then the building, a NIST model predicts fundamentally different behavior from what was observed. So they managed to get those 2 events to happen, the collapse of the east penthouse and the collapse of the building. Who knows how they got it? They won't release their model. But besides that, their model actually disproves their hypothesis because it predicts fundamentally different behavior from what was observed. So in response to our request for correction, where we made all of these points in the space of about 26 pages or so, in a single page, NIST responded. They ignored our request to correctly characterize the sudden transition to freefall. Didn't even address it in their response. They ignored our central argument that their model predicted fundamentally different structural behavior. And they basically just repeated claims that they had already published elsewhere, whether in their report or in their FAQs, including the objectively false claim that I just showed before, that the upper exterior wall deformations in their animation differed from the video images only in the later stages after the initiation of collapse. And I'll show you that on a subsequent slide here. Again, after we showed objectively that there was deformation in their animation at the point that global collapse initiated, they still just wrote to us in a single paragraph, just repeated the previous claim as if we had said nothing. So that is a screenshot from their response to request for correction. The NIST analysis and animation of the upper exterior wall deformations differ from the video images only in the later stages of the animation and only after the initiation of global collapse. It was as if that point, that analysis just didn't exist in our request for correction. Okay, so moving on, looking at the 2 other areas of evidence. We have evidence of explosions and evidence of incendiaries. We're going to focus on now evidence of explosions. And this presentation is probably going to, I should have said this in the beginning, I can't remember if Andy did or not, but it's going to run sort of 75 to 90 minutes, not our typical 50 minutes or so. Evidence of explosions, seismogram data. Okay, so this is a seismogram recorded at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory about, I don't know the exact distance. I don't have it off the top of my head, but something like 13 miles away from Manhattan, let's say. It's part of Columbia University. And I think people have heard a lot of conversation over the years, if you're not new to this issue, of seismic activity when the Twin Towers went down. There was also seismic activity when Building 7 went down. In this case, there was one signal and then a second fainter signal that was recorded when Building 7 went down. And this is one of the seismograms that show those waves. NIST details the seismic activity in the appendix to its report on Building 7. That's actually, they cover all the seismic activity for the collapse of the towers as well as Building 7 in this appendix to their report on Building 7. And so this is a abridged version of a table from that appendix where they show the two seismic signals that were generated during the destruction of Building 7. What's interesting is when you look at the time of those, they correspond to the initiation, not of the overall collapse, but of even before the East Penthouse collapse. As you see here on the right, they say event type, WTC7 collapse initiation. Then below that, for the second signal, WTC7 perimeter wall collapse. So what they actually mean here is the sort of cascade of floor failures that occurred allegedly low in the building that led to this key column, column 79, buckling, and then that allowing the East Penthouse at the top to fail, to collapse into the building. NIST claims that event generated seismic activity. Those floors in one corner of the building collapsing over maybe whatever it is, 7 or 8 stories inside the building caused seismic activity that reached 13 miles. And then the second one, and again, the timing is peculiar, and we're going to get a little more into this in a second. It occurred at the initiation of the global collapse, not when the building really started to hit the ground or during the collapse, at the initiation. And these were about 8 seconds apart or so. Okay, so, and this is from the appendix. There were 2 phases in the probable WTC7 collapse sequence that could have resulted in seismic signals. The first comprised the initial local failure and the vertical progression of failure. This is inside the building that allegedly led to the collapse of the penthouse. The interior debris falling onto the lower floors of WTC7 on the east side transmitted impact loads to the foundation. The second seismic phase comprised the global collapse of the building. And NIST actually points out themselves, one would have expected seismic signals from this second phase of collapse to be generated over this entire episode, which lasted approximately 14 seconds, since debris was continuously impacting the ground. However, because the total energy dissipated by the impact was distributed over a long period of time, the strength of the signal at any given time was small and difficult to interpret. Okay, so I'm just to make it very clear in case this is difficult to follow, I'm going to just say when these seismic signals were alleged, what NIST claims generated these seismic waves. First, right about now, or around now, there. And then right about now. And then not as much. Okay. So the first thing I want to point out, we did not point this out in the request for correction because I wasn't aware of it at the time. Vaguely aware, but it didn't become totally clear to me until more recently that this interpretation completely contradicts NIST's interpretation of the seismic data for towers 1 and 2. So this is from a paper that Graham McQueen, who we talked about earlier, published in 2009, looking at did the ground shake when the South Tower collapsed? And he did a lot of digging and dissecting, and he pointed out that according to FEMA, the start of the South Tower's collapse and the start of the seismic signal were simultaneous. So what I mean by that is once the top of the South Tower started to come, as the top of the South Tower started to come down, that's when FEMA thinks, when there was a seismic signal, FEMA attributed that to the top of the South Tower starting to come down. So there would be seismic activity as the collapse starts to happen, 60, 70 stories up. However, NIST changed that. And that is a whole other wormhole to go down, all the details and intricacies there and the reasons why this happened. But basically, NIST changed that and said, no, there wasn't any seismic activity during the collapses. It was only once the debris started hitting the ground. So this is from an FAQ, NIST Twin Towers FAQs. This is the bottom quote I'm going to read. The seismic spikes for the collapse of the WTC towers are the result of debris from the collapsing towers impacting the ground. The spikes began approximately 10 seconds after the times for the start of each building's collapse and continued for approximately 15 seconds. So for the Twin Towers, which are these huge buildings, these massive structures at the top, falling and crushing, this is in NIST's scenario, 60 to 90 stories of structure below them, there was no seismic activity. The seismic activity only started when the debris hit the ground. But for building 7, we have a handful of floors in one corner of the building collapse onto each other, and that generates seismic activity. And then the initiation of the collapse of the building generates seismic activity, but not all of the debris from the global collapse hitting each other, falling on the ground for the subsequent, 14 seconds or whatever. So it's completely backwards. So these were the central claims that we made in the request for correction. NIST was incorrect in attributing the 2 seismic signals generated during the destruction of WTC-7 to a cascade of floor failures inside the building and to the initiation of the building's global collapse. The 2 seismic signals must have been generated by 2 subaerial explosions, and those are explosions that don't occur high up in the air, but also don't occur underground. They're near the ground. And this is according to a geophysicist in France who provided a declaration for us. His name is escaping me at this exact moment, but you can find his paper on our website under technical papers. Andre Rousseau, that's it. So the 2 seismic signals must have been generated by 2 subaerial explosions that corresponded in time and location to the initiation of the collapse of WTC-7's East Penthouse and to the initiation of global collapse, respectively. So we're saying that these seismic signals were generated by explosions. That had to do with when the East Penthouse began to collapse and when the whole building started to come down. That's why you would see spikes of seismic activity at those precise moments. The energy of the waves developed in the ground by percussion of a solid mass on a solid ground, and this is according to Andre Rousseau, is too low for the waves to go further than several hundred meters. So he said there's no question, like debris from those buildings, from building 7 hitting the ground, or structural failures occurring inside the building simply will not create seismic activity that will travel more than a few hundred meters. And this is what I was alluding to before. NIST probable collapse sequence is inconsistent with the observed seismic activity. The cascade of floor failures generated the largest seismic signal out of all of the seismic activity during the collapse of Building 7. The handful of floors that collapse on each other, allegedly in the northeast corner of the building, is when we get the seismic activity, the most seismic activity. The initiation of global collapse generated a seismic signal. The initiation of global collapse would be associated with columns buckling, right? Not a huge amount of debris hitting each other. So why right at that moment? And then, of course, we have 1.8 seconds, 2.5 seconds of free fall. And so that third point there, the global collapse, including the impact after the top section free fell for 8 stories, did not generate a unique seismic signal. I would think if the entire top however many 30 stories of the building started falling for 2.5 seconds and then hit something, that maybe there you would get some more seismic activity. But no, the seismic activity pretty much all occurred before that. Demolition involving 2 subaerial explosions is perfectly consistent with the seismic data. So demolition charges can create seismic waves that will travel further than several hundred meters. 2 seismic signals occurring just before the east penthouse collapse and just before the initiation of global collapse are readily explained by detonation of demolition charges. NIST's response to this section of the request for correction was basically just, we disagree. It's our word against yours. And, you know, sort of the same as before, regurgitating the same points that are made in its report. Okay, looking at the other evidence of explosions, we have eyewitness and audio evidence. Okay, central claims in section G of the request for correction. The first claim, we made 2 separate claims. That's why I'm separating them right now. NIST ignored and distorted eyewitness reports and audio recordings indicative of explosions at the onset of and during the collapse of WTC-7. Also, which was covered in this section, NIST distorted eyewitness reports of an explosion occurring inside WTC-7 on the morning of 9/11. And so this is the account of Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, which many people who are not new to this will be familiar with. Okay, so in one section of its report, and there's also an appendix related to this, NIST writes this. They basically did an analysis that concluded that if there was any explosion that was capable of severing a key column in the building, and they focused on column 79, that it would create a very loud sound of 130 to 140 decibels. And they said there were no witness reports of such a loud noise, nor was such a noise heard on the audio tracks of video recordings of WTC-7 collapse. So many people have pointed out over the years that this analysis was sort of a straw man tactic, that there would be other ways to destroy a column, especially using things like thermite or nanothermite, and using sound abatement techniques, and that you would not necessarily need a noise this loud to destroy a column. What we said in the request was this: there are, in fact, a number of eyewitness reports and audio recordings of noises that indicate the occurrence of explosions at the onset of and during WTC-7's collapse. Far more important than whether the observed noises reached NIST's strawman decibel level is whether these noises could have been caused by structural failures and or impact of the falling debris, the impact of falling debris. And in our view, they're not. So we're going to run through some of those eyewitness accounts. Okay, the first one, NYU medical student named Daryl, minutes after the collapse, interviewed on 1010 Winds Radio.
Yeah, so I was just standing there, you know, we were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and, you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and, you know, it was horrifying. And then, you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caved out. And the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
So we heard a sound that sounded like a clap of thunder and a shockwave ripping through the building. All right, now this is a segment from a video that David Chandler put together back in 2010, looking at audio evidence of explosions, which we did cite in the request for correction. So this video contains both the audio evidence that he analyzed, as well as 2 eyewitness accounts that were also included in the request for correction. So this will take care of all of those things.
A few blocks up West Broadway, looking toward the World Trade Center in the distance, Ashley Banfield was conducting an interview for MSNBC.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your...
The mic was set to pick up speech a few inches away. From the involuntary startle response,
oh my God,
we know explosions are being heard. However, listening closely, we discovered that the microphone did indeed pick up the sounds of explosions, but very faintly. Turn up the volume. Listen for a low rumble in the background.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here?
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God.
This time, the sound has been filtered to emphasize low frequencies. Listen for booms like a bass drum in the distance.
In fact, you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. You've got Carolina here. They advised us to leave because you have, oh my God.
Here's a different version, filtered to emphasize the mid-range sounds. The bass drum is gone. I would describe the blast sound like a train on a bumpy track.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. You've got Carolina here.
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have.
Oh my God.
Here's the original sound again.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. You've got Carolina here.
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have.
Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No.
If you didn't hear the blasts, back up, use earphones, turn up the volume, and listen again. There were 2 blasts, followed by 7 more, regularly spaced, all in 2.5 seconds. Craig Bartmer's testimony may come to mind.
The whole time you hear boom, 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 boom. I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
When we hear the sharp, regular series of sounds in the background, the building has not yet started to fall. When we hear the reporters say, "This is it,"
This is it.
the building has not yet started to fall. The fall of the building corresponds to the crescendo in the crowd response. Here is another street scene with the building in full view. The crowd responds almost immediately as the building starts to fall. This occurs just after the reporter says, "This is it."
This is it. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Therefore, the blasts we heard occurred seconds before the building started to fall.
All right. So, and by the way, you are hearing this presentation through when you hear the audio of the videos, it's running through my speakers to my microphone and to you. So if you were not able to hear those things very well, you can look for that video and listen for yourself. WTC sound evidence for explosions. Let me just move on here. But I want to point out real briefly that this is, you think about the seismic activity occurring before the actual collapse, related to the East Penthouse, and the fact that there would have to be some sort of event occurring in the building to bring down the East Penthouse. That's why there is explosions and why there's seismic activity before the global collapse and more associated with the East Penthouse. And these things, as you can see, are all starting to fit together.
A few blocks up.
Okay. So as we were part of the way through this request for correction process, right, the day that we submitted the appeal in September of 2020, somebody sent me and others this eyewitness account, which I had never seen before. And I'm going to go ahead and play it first, and then I'll talk about it a little more. But after some further analysis, we determined that she was definitely talking about Building 7, and this was filmed an hour and 10 minutes after Building 7 went down. So at 6:30 p.m. on 9/11.
Possibility that the fire was going to get worse. All of a sudden, a loud, incredibly loud explosion, and we have the video to show you.
Okay. So that was very interesting because despite all these, obviously Craig Bartmer, the NYPD police officer, years later, he's talking about hearing explosions, but this was the first example that we had of somebody talking, literally using the word explosion on the day of 9/11, who witnessed the collapse of Building 7, and, which more clearly and strongly contradicts NIST's claim that there were no witness reports of a very loud sound. So, we figured out where she was based on the video clip. She was relatively closer than a lot of reporters were that day. I can't remember the exact cross street, but she was relatively close. This was after we had submitted the appeal, so we were like, shucks, it would have been nice to include that. After a couple months of kind of digging further to figure out where this was and who it was, we decided to go ahead and submit this along with a couple other eyewitness accounts that we didn't submit previously. So that was in December of 2020. We were, it was just additional evidence regarding the same claim that we were already making. So we figured that NIST would, basically say, okay, whatever, additional evidence. We had trouble actually figuring out who this reporter was, because the video is so grainy. It was so long ago. Her name is not given. We originally thought it was a reporter named on a pergament. But then I managed to get in touch with the cameraman who was named in this clip, I think in a later part of the clip. And he finally got back to me like a month or a month and a half later and said, oh, that's Gigi Stone Woods. And so we followed up, we tried to track her down. She has a website and we emailed her and she got back to us. And this was then after we submitted the supplement. She wrote me this email. Hi, Ted. Yes, I am the reporter in that video. All I remember is that we were reporting near Building 7, heard a loud explosion and people yelling to run, and we all did. So she repeated her statement. She stood by her statement from that day that she heard a loud explosion. So we then, this would be roughly a month after we submitted the supplemental information to NIST in December. We followed up with NIST and said, here's that witness. This is her email address. How about if you actually go ahead and contact her and interview her? And we were very interested to see how NIST would handle this new piece of evidence. It turned out that NIST sort of dismissed it summarily, as they did with pretty much all of the claims and the evidence and arguments that we made in the request for correction. So this is NIST's final response in the summer of 2021. This is what they said about this supplemental submission that we made regarding Gigi Stone Woods' account. Since the supplemental information and the additional emails were submitted well beyond 30 calendar days from August 28th, 2020, they were excluded from the record. However, for the same reasons explicated below, had they been considered by NIST, they would not have altered NIST's decision on the appeal. Okay. I would think that if NIST were a sincere investigation, that they would be interested in any information related to how the building may have collapsed and would not be wanting to exclude evidence based on arbitrary procedural grounds. This is what they said later in their letter, which is supposed to explain why all of the evidence we provided did not cause them to change their conclusion. The requester appellant's approach has many differences with the approach taken by NIST. These differences include the methods used to collect and analyze first-person accounts. Due to these differences, the resulting outcomes from the requester appellant's approach do not have an impact on NIST's findings. So they're saying that the methods that they use to collect and analyze first-person accounts are different from ours, I guess. Of course, we don't have access. They said that they interviewed hundreds of witnesses. We didn't have that opportunity to. We could try. There's a few that people in the 9/11 research community have found, but we don't have the same resources or powers or publicity as NIST. But anyway, I would have thought they would have wanted to interview her. The second part of this section of the request for correction, NIST distorted eyewitness reports of an explosion occurring inside WTC-7 on the morning of 9/11. I'm just going to play for you those two eyewitness accounts as they were given on the day of 9/11. They're pretty short.
Well, me and Mr. Hesh, the corporation counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh. I said, this is it. We're dead. We're not going to make it out of here.
Okay. And by the way, this probably occurred. There's some difference of opinion about when this may have occurred, but my sense is, based on all the evidence, what I've read, is that this probably occurred around 10:15 a.m. So between the collapse of the South Tower and the North Tower.
Yes, I was. I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor, and when all the power went out in the building, another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion, and we've been trapped on the 8th floor with smoke, thick smoke all around us for about an hour and a half.
Okay. So this obviously presents a problem for NIST's hypothesis, their scenario of how the building came down. They interviewed Barry Jennings and Michael Hess as part of their investigation. And this is what NIST ended up writing in their report. And bear with me, it's a little long, but two New York City employees had gone to the OEM Center on the 23rd floor. That's important to note, and found no one there. As they went to get into the elevator and go downstairs, the lights inside Building 7 flickered as WTC-2 collapsed, which was at 9:59 a.m. At that point, the elevator they were attempting to catch no longer worked, so they started down the staircase. When they got to the 6th floor, WTC1 collapsed. The lights went out in the staircase, the sprinklers at an unspecified location came on briefly, and the staircase filled with smoke and debris. Now, the problem with NIST's story here is they're saying that it took Barry Jennings and Michael Hess about 28 minutes or thereabouts, 29 minutes to descend 16 floors. If you do the math, that would be something like 1 minute and 45 seconds for every floor. And that's obviously nobody would take that long to descend one floor. They were actually running down the stairs, as Barry Jennings has described in subsequent interviews after the day of 9/11. So there's no way that it would take them 28 minutes or what have you to descend those floors. Probably would have taken them something like 5 minutes at most, maybe, I don't know, maybe 10. But so the event that they witnessed, there's no way, as NIST now tries to claim, that explosion that they reported on the day of 9/11 was debris from the North Tower hitting the building. That is impossible. And we know that they really couldn't have left the 23rd floor any later than 9:59 a.m. That's where NIST puts it. And if anything, they left sooner. But let's say it's 9:59 a.m. There's no way that it's taken them that long. There's no way that the explosion that they witnessed was in any way related to the collapse of the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. There's also other evidence of significant interior structural damage around that floor, the 6th, 7th, 8th floor area, of elevator cars being ejected from the elevator shafts, of entire floors missing and hanging, of columns in that core area being severed already at that very early hour. Well, I'm going to say no, that was witnessed a little bit later, but there's no way that debris hitting the south face of Building 7 is going to cause that amount of damage to the interior of the building, to the core area of the building. It's going to cause elevator cars to be ejected from their shafts. And so that damage pattern is probably most likely related to the same event or types of events that Barry Jennings and Michael Hess witnessed as they were descending the stairs inside Building 7. So our request to NIST was to revise their scenario or explain how on earth it took those two men 29 minutes to descend 16 floors. And this was all that NIST gave us back in response to that request. NIST disagrees with the assertion that it distorted eyewitness reports of an explosion occurring inside WTC-7. The rescue events documented in NC Star 1-9, section 652, are based on 8 independent interviews. That's it. So I thought, when I read that, I thought they were going to then explain what was in those interviews, but there was nothing. So they just disagree, and they did a lot of interviews. Okay. All right, so the last thing is evidence of incendiaries. We've covered so far structural behavior, and we've covered evidence of explosions. By incendiaries, I really mean thermite and or thermate and nanothermite. And there's evidence to suggest that both thermate and nanothermite, well, I'm not going to say directly nanothermite in Building 7. It's hard to say, but there's evidence that nanothermite was in dust recovered from the World Trade Center. There's also direct evidence, as I'm going to get to here, that something called thermate, or a type of thermite using sulfur, was used inside Building 7. Okay, so this is a picture. This is obviously on the title slide of this presentation of NIST investigator John Gross in the steel yards in the fall of 2001, posing next to this piece of steel that is severely eroded, which is going to be the subject of our discussion right now. John Gross was working for NIST at this time on behalf, and he was representing NIST on the FEMA investigation. That's the investigation that was conducted in the first 9 months after 9/11. And so NIST had played a part in that. There was approximately 20 some engineers and other experts involved in that preliminary investigation. So John Gross himself was aware of this steel that had been severely eroded so much that there were holes in it. I think steel, obviously we know steel melts at a very high temperature that normal fires cannot reach. And so that's the starting point for why it's so curious that this steel was melted. Okay, so this steel was first documented in Appendix C of the FEMA report. I'm just going to quote a few sections from this Appendix C. Two structural steel members with unusual erosion patterns were observed in the WTC debris field. The first appeared to be from WTC 7, and the second from either WTC 1 or WTC 2. Although the exact location of this beam in the building was not known, the severe erosion found in several beams warranted further consideration. So it wasn't just one beam from Building 7. It was actually many beams from Building 7. And numerous people have spoken of this. One in particular, Astane Asel, he's a engineering professor from Berkeley who had a grant from the National Science Foundation, who talked of seeing melted girders and described multiple steel members from Building 7 having these sorts of erosion patterns on them. Evidence of a severe high-temperature or corrosion attack on the steel, including oxidation and sulfidation with a subsequent intergranular melting, was readily visible in the near-surface microstructure. Severe corrosion and subsequent erosion of samples 1 and 2 are a very unusual event. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. A detailed study into the mechanisms of this phenomenon is needed to determine what risk, if any, is presented to existing steel structures exposed to severe and long-burning fires. So Appendix C of the FEMA report called for further study into this phenomenon. And following that, NIST Director Arden Bement at a congressional hearing said that NIST would address all major recommendations contained in the FEMA report. But NIST did not seek to perform tests on recovered steel from WTC-7 to determine the cause of the severe erosion. Okay, now here's a clip of Shyam Sundar at the 2008 technical briefing addressing this piece of steel.
With regard to the issue of the residue, there's a reference often made to a piece of steel from Building 7 that is documented in the earlier FEMA report that deals with some kind of a residue that was found, sulfur-oriented residue. And in fact, that was found by a professor who was then at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Professor Jonathan Barnett. But that piece of steel has been subsequently analyzed by Professor Barnett and by Professor Rick Sisson, who is also from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And they reported in a BBC interview that aired on July 6th that there was no evidence that any of the residue in that piece of steel had any relationship to an undue fire event in the building or any other kind of incendiary device in the building.
Okay, so based on this interview that these guys gave on BBC, I guess NIST doesn't need to, they've taken care of that. They've explained it. NIST doesn't need to bother itself with what happened to that piece of steel. It's interesting that he noted the date of the interview, I guess, of the BBC special. Maybe he sat down and watched it. Maybe he had some popcorn. All right, so this is a clip from that BBC show where we're going to, I'll just play it. This is Worcester Polytechnic Institute Professor Richard Sisson in 2008. He says, "I don't find it very mysterious at all." He's also one of the professors who was described in an article in the WPI Transformations newspaper in 2001 or 2002 saying, "This Swiss cheese appearance shocked all the Firewise professors at Worcester Polytechnic Institute." So he was shocked when he first came across it, but 7 years later, he doesn't find it mysterious at all.
Well, it was attacked by what we determined was a liquid slag. When we did the analysis, we actually identified it as a liquid containing iron, sulfur, and oxygen. You can see what it does is it attacks the grain boundaries, and this bit would eventually have fallen out, and it would continue the attack.
Professor Sisson says it didn't melt, it eroded. The cause were those very hot fires and the debris after 9/11 that cooked the steel over weeks. The sulfur came from masses of gypsum wallboard that was pulverized and burnt in the fires.
I don't find it very mysterious at all. That if I have steel in this sort of a high temperature atmosphere that's rich in oxygen and sulfur, this would be the kind of result I would expect.
Okay. It's interesting that the narrator says that it was caused by the gypsum, but he doesn't say that directly, or at least maybe he did during the interview. But So what is he basing that on? The latest paper that he and people on his team published was in 2006, and we touched on this in the request for correction. The title of the article, it's a little smaller, but it says metal removal via slag attack of the steel from Building 7 of the World Trade Center, some observations. So they ran an experiment to see if they could reproduce this melting, this erosion that was seen on this beam and other beams. And so reading from this quote from their paper, however, preliminary experiments at 1100 degrees Celsius, which is extremely hot, I just want to point out, 1100 degrees Celsius with mixtures of iron sulfide and iron oxide placed on the steel surface and heated in air. So heated in air for 1100 degrees for 24 hours, that the reaction was not fast and dissolved little metal in 24 hours. This observation indicates that the liquid slag attack probably took place during the prolonged exposure to the fire in the rubble. Now, that probably is interesting. Why assume that it needs longer time? Maybe that if that's the case, then why don't you run the experiment for longer and see if it happens? They didn't do that, but they assumed that it probably just needed to go on for longer. Well, why not, if you're not getting any erosion, why not actually question your hypothesis? So in the request for correction, we pointed out, in addition to this fact that this experiment that they didn't continue essentially was inconsistent with their hypothesis. Their hypothesis is fatally flawed for the simple reason that iron does not react with gypsum, which is composed of calcium sulfate. In chemical terms, iron is not electropositive enough to reduce sulfate. Gypsum wallboard is commonly used for fire protection for the fundamental reason that it cannot burn. The notion of gypsum wallboard burning for a sustained period of time and forming a liquid eutectic with iron is illogical on its face. So our request to NIST in the request for correction was to do the study that they didn't do at WPI, and to do the study that NIST has not already done. So obtain the WTC7 steel sample and conduct analyses to determine the cause of severe erosion. Conduct further experiments to reproduce the observed severe erosion and determine the viability of the gypsum wallboard hypothesis versus the viability of the nanothermite hypothesis. What was NIST's response to our request for correction? In the absence of a method to confirm that the FEMA 403 sample 1 that was tested at WPI is in fact steel from WTC7, there is no justifiable basis for conducting further analyses to examine other theories that explain the cause of the erosion in the sample. So NIST has basically played a brand new card that we don't know for sure that this steel is from Building 7, and therefore they say there's no justifiable basis for conducting further analyses. Now, first of all, even if we don't know for sure 100% that the steel is from WTC7, if the NIST investigation were a sincere investigation, they would want to examine this steel and find out the cause of the erosion. Because maybe the steel was from Building 7, and maybe the erosion of this steel had something to do with the collapse of the building. Just maybe. So the idea of excluding it because you don't know for sure is totally unscientific. Beyond that, everything points to the, I'm going to say, almost fact that this steel is from Building 7. First, I'm going to play this clip, another clip from that BBC special.
In New England, the claims of the mysterious melted steel from Tower 7 has been unraveled. It was found by fire protection engineer Professor Jonathan Barnett in a salvage yard.
It came from a much larger beam. This was the size of steel that they used in the construction of Tower 7. They didn't use this particular kind of steel in Towers 1 or Towers 2. So that's why we know its pedigree.
Okay, so Jonathan Barnett and every single engineer or scientist who studied this piece of steel since 2001 believes that this steel is from Building 7 because that type of steel wasn't used in the towers, and because they're aware that multiple pieces of steel that were apparently from Building 7 had the same erosion on them. And here we list all of the reasons why the steel is almost certainly from Building 7. Total consensus that it was from Building 7, as I just said. Numerous pieces from Building 7 had severe erosion, described in the FEMA report, described by Astani as Asel. Previous statements from NIST acknowledging the source of the steel as Building 7, including Shyam Sunder in that clip from 2008. Much steel from Building 7 was tagged with WTC7 on it, and including steel in the same pile as the piece in question. So if you look at this photo on the bottom left, it's hard, it's kind of dark, but there's a little WTC7 marking there. And at the top of the pile, sorry, let me use this. Right there, you've got a WTC7 marking. At the top of the pile is that one piece of severely eroded steel. And so there's a good chance that this steel, all of the steel is from Building 7, especially because Buildings 5 and Building 6, which maybe had the same type of steel in them, those buildings weren't completely collapsed and broken apart. And they didn't really start disassembling those buildings until later. And there are photos that, the fall of 2001, later in the fall of 2001, when Building 7 has been mostly cleaned up, you still see Buildings 5 and Building 6 standing there. So this is virtually certain that this steel is from Building 7. So the idea that NIST would refuse that is NIST's sole basis for refusing to study it is profoundly unscientific. Okay, so to summarize everything here, how did NIST sidestep the evidence? Regarding the structural behavior, NIST claimed that the computer model matched the structural behavior when in fact it did not. When it came to evidence of explosions, they attributed seismic signals to implausible causes in their collapse sequence, such as the collapse of relatively small floor sections within one corner of the building. They ignored eyewitness accounts eyewitness reports of explosions, and they provided an implausible scenario to explain the eyewitness accounts of explosions inside the building that morning. Regarding the evidence of incendiaries, they've now refused to examine the steel on the unscientific grounds that it may not actually be from Building 7, when everyone who's studied it believes that it is from Building 7. All right, so for more information about the request for correction, you can go to ae911truth.org/NIST. To watch this webinar and other webinars, you can go to ae911truth.org/webinars. If you're interested in getting involved and giving these kinds of presentations to audiences, engineering audiences in particular, go to Project Due Diligence, ae911truth.org/project due diligence. And if you want to help financially, you can go to ae911truth.org/donate so that we can continue to get this information out and educate the engineering community and the larger public about this event and correct the record on how this building and the Twin Towers came down on 9/11. So thank you very much for participating, and I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any.
All right, Ted, thank you very much. Very informative. And yeah, you're going to take a lot of questions tonight. People are very interested in all the stuff you're bringing to us. So before we get to those, I just want to remind any engineers out there that you can get credit for viewing this presentation. Just write to us at cpd@ae911truth.org. Tell us your name, confirm you're an engineer, and tell us what your biggest technical takeaway is from this presentation tonight. All right, so someone wrote, one top-down view of the connection of girder A2001 to column 79 shows the girder meets the column at an angle. Would this angle give any credence to NIST's walking theory?
The short answer is no. We cover this in the other webinars that I mentioned. It is also covered in the request for correction. So if you go to ae911truth.org/NIST, in I want to say pretty much the section A of the request for correction, you can look at the different views of girder A2001 and its connection to column 79 and see that when girder A2001 would have expanded due to thermal expansion, even despite the slight angle that it's at with respect to column 79, it would expand enough that it would become trapped behind the side plate on column 79 and would not be able to be pushed westward any further. So hopefully the person who answered that, at least asked that question, can understand what I'm saying there. There's a lot of technical detail involved in that, but it is covered in the request for correction as well as in our other webinars.
Okay, so the next one says, and there's a couple of questions that sound alike, so I'll just read both of them and you can address them. Excuse me, did the NIST model include fireproofing on the structural members? And another person says, how does NIST/Sunder account for the fireproofing which wasn't blown off by an airplane impact?
You know, I'm not an expert in sort of like the fire simulation and the different runs that NIST did in the fireproofing. I'm gonna like make an educated guess that NIST did include the fireproofing on the steel, because the steel could not have been removed from those floors, from floor 13, and that NIST is claiming that the thermal expansion happened even despite the existence of the fireproofing. But that's just an educated guess.
Right, and despite the fires in the area collapse initiation, which photos and videos, I guess, show were out an hour before. All right, next one says, how can NIST say the floors sequentially failed and the falling mass increased the force on the floors below when essentially in free fall means almost weightless, which means essentially no force?
Okay, it sounds like maybe we're talking about the towers there. If we're talking about floors falling sequentially in building 7, you know, we're talking really about the northeast section where the floors allegedly cascaded on top of each other and left that column 79 laterally unsupported for, I don't know, 9 stories. And there's a lot of evidence indicating that would be impossible. The floors below would be able to withstand the fall of Girder 8 2001, and we're not that damaged. If you really dig into NIST's scenario where there was fire damage on other floors, there was not enough damage to allow for all the rest of the floors to just collapse after that one girder collapse. We're talking about the towers and free fall or near free fall, and you know, the ability of the top section to crush through the stories below, which maybe where that question was going. You know, the short answer is the analysis of Tony Zamboti and Richard Johns that's published in the International Journal of Protective Structures. That's also written in the discussion paper that they've been fighting for more than a decade to get published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. Shows that the collapse would have arrested within 2 stories. There was not enough energy from the fall of the top section to crush through those stories, and certainly not at the rate that was observed on 9/11. The top section would have decelerated significantly when it impacted the first story below it, and there was no deceleration observed in the video footage.
All right, next question says, why did Shyam Sunder say the 5.4 seconds came from a model, but John Gross said the 5.4 seconds came from watching the video frame by frame?
Yeah, so in the early days before NIST came up with their 3 stages, Shyam Sunder talked about the model saying that it predicted a certain amount of time for the building to come down to the point where it was no longer visible. And Shyam Sunder said in that technical briefing that the model predicted that certain amount of time, 5.4 seconds. John Gross said that it was based on some little movement or whatever that occurred, roughly a second, 1.75 seconds or what have you, before the whole building went into free fall. David Chandler argues in his videos, NIST finally admits free fall, that they were kind of messing with the observables in order to say that that their modeling matched the observes, and they just happened to match exactly. I feel like the ball has moved a little bit since then in terms of, NIST revised their analysis a little bit after the draft report, and basically what I quoted in this presentation about following a single point along the roof line, that is what NIST analysis is now based on, more than what John John Gross was describing in the 2008 technical briefing. And so as David Chandler kind of discovered in the spring of 2020, when we were putting the request for correction together, there was a little bit of movement in the middle of the building. So prior to that, he had not really discovered that. And he thought that it was like complete fabrication. And he was looking at one corner of the building where it went into free fall instantaneously, whereas NIST is talking about movement earlier than that. There was a little bit of movement earlier than that. If you look at it from that camera angle that we showed there, that David Chandler used more recently. The problem, as I said in the presentation, is regardless of what little bit of movement you get there in the middle of the building, NIST generalizes that movement to represent the movement of the entire roof line. And it's not irrelevant that there was movement in the middle of the building, but what's really relevant is that all 3 points, the middle and both corners, went into free fall at the exact same time when the corners were previously motionless and the middle was only moving a little bit. So that's the full picture now. I think we now have the full picture of that question of the initiation of the collapse and the downward motion of the roof line.
All right. Last question here. Shyam Sunder said WTC7 cannot free fall because structural components below, but for WTC1, NIST said the top came down essentially in free fall with over 90 floors below. Isn't that a contradiction?
It is. NIST in their FAQs do say that the top section came down essentially in free fall. Of course, serious students of 9/11 know that it was not complete free fall. The top section of the North Tower came down actually at about 64% of free fall. But the key is that it was constantly accelerating at that same rate and it never decelerated. That is really the important thing to remember. It doesn't need to be free fall for it to be controlled demolition. The 9/11 truth research community is not saying that the Twin Towers came down in free fall. They came down a little bit slower than that. But the key is that the top section of the North Tower never decelerated. It just consistently accelerated at about 64% of free fall.
All right, good question there. And this is a guy who always finds contradictions in the NIST reports. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give Ted a hand. I won't do it. Maybe let's do it literally. But good job, Ted, and thank you everybody for tuning in tonight, for watching these webinars. I know we have algorithms against us, a lot of censorship going on the internet, but nothing can beat human will. So get this video out to people that you debate about this with in your life. Send it out to reporters, anybody that you can. They need to see this. And come back next month in November. We're going to have a new series of webinars, new presenters. We'll tell you about it in a few weeks, but you're definitely going to want to see it. A lot of great analysis and information presented here on our YouTube channel and, of course, at ae911truth.org. So this is Andy Steele and Ted Walter, and we will see you next month. Have a great night.